tonight. We're still in chapter 1. We'll be there for a little bit longer. Verses 14 through 18 is what we're covering. I've entitled this lesson, What Jesus Does. What Jesus Does, as John continues to explain to his readers who Jesus is. Now he's moved on to what he does. John's introduction, it kind of ends right here. What we've looked at so far in the first verses, and it doesn't say that in the Bible or anything. I'm just calling that his introduction. I feel like it ends here. His introduction is a purely, and I'm sure you noticed it, his introduction is a purely theological introduction to who Jesus is. Say, well, what would the difference be? Well, the difference would be, Matthew starts his book by explaining the genealogy of Jesus all the way up to his birth, going way back. Luke does the same thing, and Luke begins before Jesus is born. He begins with the whole history, the short history before Jesus is born till after he's born. John, we see how John begins the story of Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's his beginning. So it's like I said, it's a purely theological beginning. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Next week, John's going to start telling his story about Jesus, which is he'll pick up in some narrative form. First off, I use that word a lot, and I just thought, just for fun, just in case there's any misunderstanding, what does the word theological mean? It has a very, very simple meaning, but it's a fancy word. Of course, it comes from the word theology, so you might even say, what does theology mean? God words. Yeah, that's a good way to say it. God words, or, any kind of ology. Biology, the study of living things, right? Theology, theos, means God. Ology means the study of. So theology simply means the study of God. Theological is just a take off of that. It means the same thing. It's just so that's what it really means. And what is a narrative? A narrative is storytelling. A narrative is like, hey, let me tell you a story about what me and my friends did a few years ago, and then we started off on the long journey and start telling the story. That's a narrative. You're telling a story. Here's our text for tonight. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified about him and cried out, saying, This was he of whom I said, He who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. For of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. All right, a lot to unpack within those short verses there. Okay, so tonight our points is this. So what Jesus does, our main points are going to be this. And I will admit that I did steal these 3 Ds. From John MacArthur. I like the way he outlined the chapter. I don't always do that, but sometimes I do. Jesus displays glory. Jesus dispenses grace. I like that. It reminds me of like a dispenser, like a Pez dispenser. Jesus is a grace dispenser. Jesus demonstrates God. So we begin with our first point. Jesus displays glory. Jesus displays glory. Verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That word dwelt is the word tabernacle. It's the same word for tabernacle. Jesus became, then the word became flesh, and it literally says, and tabernacled among us. And we saw his glory as of the only begotten from the Father. Now, there's some interesting language here, and we're going to see it again very soon, so let me talk about it just a little bit. But before I get to that language, what does it mean to see the glory of Jesus? What does John mean? John says, we saw his glory. What's John mean by that? Yeah, there was something special about him over everybody else. It was not a regular prophet or priest or king. That's for sure. Yeah. I mean, John saw. What do you think comes to John's mind when he says, "Well, who is we?" He says, "We saw his glory." Who's he talking about? The followers, yeah. And he's probably just specifically talking about, closest to his heart, probably the 12 apostles. But of course, we know there were many, many followers. The 12 weren't the only ones that followed him around during his ministry. So when John says we, he might put in parentheses there, you know who you are. You know, if you were with me, you know that you were there. We saw his glory. When did John see his glory in a way that most of the other apostles didn't? Yeah, on the Mount of Transfiguration. John was one of three that got to see Jesus basically peel back the skin and saw him in his glorified body on the mount, what we call the Mount of Transfiguration, and shining like the sun, talking with Moses and Elijah. So that could be one meaning of we saw his glory. But I think, while John may very well have had that in mind, he also just could have had in mind every single thing that he witnessed Jesus do. From the way that he conducted himself and just regular conversation with other people, to the way that he did miracles, lots of miraculous things, to the way that he preached. When you witness Jesus do anything, God's glory was on display. Yeah, and I can't even, that's a mind-boggling thing. If you couldn't hear Rex said, witnessing the perfection. I said we can't wrap our mind around that because none of us have ever been around someone who did everything perfectly. Didn't have a single imperfect action or a single imperfect word. And that's just, that's stuff that boggles the mind. The other interesting thing is, and we're going to see this language again in John, and this language has been around forever, so it's not going anywhere, but I don't like it a whole lot, and I'll show you why. This that I have underlined here, we saw his glory as of the only begotten. Of course, we've heard it referenced, and we've probably said it ourselves, Jesus, the only begotten of God. The word for those words in the Greek of the only begotten is just one word, and it's monogenes. Monogenes. You may have even heard preachers before refer to Jesus as the monogenes. Mono, of course, it just means one. Genes means let me move aside from breaking down the Greek. Monogenes means unique and privileged. Uniquely privileged. So we could also say it, and I'm gonna do something here in just a second to help us wrap our brain fully around that. Because uniquely privileged, that sounds like something that's not the easiest thing in the world to comprehend either, I don't think. I mean, it's not to me anyways. So I want to press that a little bit further. If the reason I don't like the word begotten here, well, you tell me, why do you think I don't like the word begotten in reference to Jesus? It sounds like physical birth. Yeah, I mean, that's the way the word is used. I mean, that's what the word means in every sense, in every single instance that it's used, except when you're referring to Jesus. So why the translators use the word begotten, I have no idea. Jesus was not born. So that's a big thing we talked about in our previous lesson. Jesus was not born. Jesus was not created. Of course, he was born onto the earth. He came to the earth, was born here, but he existed. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. Jesus was not made. He is on equal footing with the Father. And if that, we have to understand Jesus in that way. Mm-hmm. It does, yeah. It does. It possibly so. I see where the confusion comes in. Here I put in quotations here the way that I wish that it read. This is the Wes version. Take that for what it's worth. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory that was one of a kind. That's truly what it reads in its most literal translated form. Glory that was one of a kind. Jesus is God's one of a kind Son. One and only, yeah. And that carries what I was saying about not only is he unique, but he's also privileged. He's the only one. Of course, let me carry this on because we could make an argument that he's not the only one in other senses. The angels many times in the Bible are referred to as what? The sons of God. And people, creation is referred to as the offspring of God. So why is Jesus the only, referred to as the only? Well, I'll show you. Just hang with me a second. Let's go all the way back to Genesis chapter 22. Genesis 22, verse 2 and verse 12. I'll put some pieces of a puzzle together for you just to help our understanding. And truly, this was to help my understanding, and hopefully that'll wash over onto you all as well. God said to Abraham at this point, take now your son, your only son. You remember when we talked about this in Tom's class. I know that you fear God since you have not withheld your son. He says it again, your only son. In the Hebrew, this is Yahid, which means the exact same thing as what we have in the New Testament when Jesus is referred to as God's only son. It means the exact same thing, uniquely privileged, your one-of-a-kind son. Of course, this isn't referring to Jesus. This is referring to Isaac. Is Isaac Abraham's only son? No, but he is his only unique son. How is he unique? He's a son of promise. He is his only son with his wife, with Abraham's wife, Sarah. So in that sense, he is Abraham's only son. And only not being a good way to even say that. He is his one-of-a-kind son with Sarah. Okay? He is the son of the promise. God did not promise to make Abraham a great nation through Sarah's handmaid. So Ishmael was not the son of promise. By God's grace, God made Ishmael a great nation as well. I've answered that. I didn't realize that was there. How was Isaac uniquely privileged? Yeah, we've answered that, so let's go to the next. So, is Jesus God's only son? We kind of answered that as well. Well, in one sense, yes. In another sense, no. How is Jesus uniquely privileged? How is he unique compared to us? I mean, we can count the ways. I mean, but what are biggest things? Yeah, he's the only one that is the perfect image of God. While we are all image bearers of God, but imperfect image bearers of God. We were all created. None of us would be here had God not created us, which is not the same as Jesus. So, yeah, it says he was at the Father's side. Yeah. So, lots of unique things, lots of big unique things about Jesus that makes him one of a kind. Who else? When we think about people who saw God's glory, think about the Old Testament. Who else is known for having seen God's glory? Moses. Yeah, Moses. Let's look. Let me show you something from Moses right quick. Exodus 33, verses 18 and 19. And I promise this is all going to tie together. Well, I think it will. Then Moses said, I pray you, show me your glory. This is Moses talking to God. Show me your glory. And God said, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you and will proclaim the name of the Lord. This is the Lord speaking. I will proclaim the name of the Lord, speaking in first person, before you. Okay? So, chapter 34, verses 5 through 8 is when he does this. I want you to see something very unique about this. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood there with Moses, as Moses called upon the name of the Lord. Then the Lord passed by in front of him and proclaimed. Now, this is God saying this, okay? So God's passing by Moses. You know, Moses can't see him because he's hiding him in the cleft of the rock there, like the song says. And as the Lord passes by Moses, this is what God says. The Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. So isn't that interesting? That's what God says when he passes by Moses. In verse 8, Moses made haste to bow low toward the earth and worship. Something interesting I want you to see about this text. To see the glory of God and the glory of Christ, which is one and the same, is not only to see him physically, but to witness him live out his attributes. It's not just seeing him physically, it's to witness him live out his attributes. This is what Moses saw and witnessed as God displayed himself. And this is what John saw and witnessed as Jesus displayed himself as well. So how does John describe Jesus' display of glory? he describes it with these words: grace and truth. And even though John's going to do lots of things to describe Jesus in lots of ways, here at the beginning, these are the two key words, the two main words that he wants you to associate with seeing the glory of Jesus, seeing the glory of God. Now, God has lots of attributes. These are the two that John mentions here. We saw his glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full. And that word "full" is a very full word. I mean, it's completely full is what that means. Completely filled up. Jesus was completely filled up with grace and truth. Of all of Jesus' attributes, why do you suppose that John chose grace and truth to describe how Jesus displayed the glory of God? And before you just think about that for a second, and let me say, like, well, because you might think, well, why wouldn't he describe him like that? Well, he would describe him like that, but notice he doesn't say the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and justice, which he could have said, which is also true. Why grace and truth? Yeah. I mean, it's the two of the best things. I mean, probably the two best things. The grace, because of God's grace, we have our sins forgiven. Man's greatest need, to have their sins forgiven. But that does not happen absent of truth. No one was ever forgiven absent of truth, as far as I can tell. Let's explore that just a little bit more. Here's my hypothesis. You can't truly realize or understand grace without truth. Like, grace is something that has to be explained to us. And especially understanding, and we can understand grace from a human perspective. Hopefully we give each other plenty of grace. But then when we compare the grace that we give to one another to the grace that God gave us, it begs the question of us, how much grace are we truly giving one another? Not nearly. Yeah, not nearly what Christ has given us. And we're called to, I mean, how much, is there a cutoff for how much grace we're called to give to one another? I know what you're thinking. I know somebody's got to be thinking, well, won't I end up being a doormat? I don't think so. No, I mean, because there's a balance of things. But just think about, am I harsh with people? Am I forgiving with people? Or am I quick to give grace? Am I quick to forgive like God forgave me? Grace and truth both have to do with salvation, which is John's chief purpose for writing this book. Again, I told you we'd come back to these verses time and again, and I'll bring them up from every so often in the lessons. But John 20, 30, and 31. Therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that, the whole purpose of the whole book, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. That's what he wants you to believe. That after you read his book, he wants you to believe that more than anything else. He wants you to believe that Jesus is the Savior, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. It is possible to have everlasting life on the foundation of believing that Jesus is the Christ, who is the Son of God. He is truly who John describes him to be. That's why it's so important that early on in the book of John that we understand who the true Jesus is. Not the Jesus that so many other false religions say that Jesus is. We need to understand who the true Jesus is. And speaking of truth, verse 15. John testified about Jesus and cried out, saying, of course, this is not John, the writer here. This is John writing about John the Baptist. John testified about him, about Jesus, and cried out, saying, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. Now, just for fun, that's an interesting thing that John the Baptist said Jesus existed before me. Chronologically speaking, who was born first? John. Yeah. John wanted the people to understand too, like, yeah, I beat Jesus to the physical presence of this earth by about 6 months. But he existed before me. So why do you think John, and here's your hint, think biblically, think like a first century Jew. Why would John throw in John the Baptist's testimony about Jesus with his own here? Why is that important, especially to the Jews? Yeah, the testimony of two witnesses. John, as he's writing this book, he very cleverly is saying, this is not just my testimony. This is also the things I'm saying to you. I said Jesus existed before the beginning, but you know who else said that? John the Baptist said it. I'm not the only one who's saying it. So he's adding to his own testimony by adding that John said the same thing that he did. And he's doing it because of the principle that we find in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15. The law is talking about something, but this particular law has a principle embedded in it. The law said, a single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. That's meaning that we find someone dead in the countryside, and I'm the only witness, and I come and I say, I saw Rex do it. I saw Rex kill that guy, and so there he is. If nobody else witnessed, Rex will not be convicted per Old Testament law, unless there's some other evidence that will prove it. Now, that doesn't mean that he always got away with it, because witness evidence was not the only evidence, just like it's not the only evidence today. But if the only evidence was my testimony against Rex, and the reason why the law was like that, of course, was to safeguard, somebody from getting mad at someone saying they committed a crime that had the death penalty. Okay, so that's what the law said, so that's not part of the lesson. Here's the principle, though. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. Well, you might ask, well, let me see if I got a question here. Okay, yeah. This statement is a standalone principle. Now, it's very important to understand how we know things in the Bible that are standalone principles and things that are not. They have to be things that are consistent throughout the Bible. We can't, what I'm saying is, you can't pick one sentence from the Bible and say, well, this is always true about everything because it's written here in the Bible. That doesn't make, you can't make something a principle just by saying that it's a principle. However, when Jesus tells us that this Old Testament principle is a principle, we can go with that. Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 and 16, the words of Christ. Jesus said, if your brother sins, and again, we're not concerned about what he's teaching at this particular point, but just hang with me for the principle. If your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you. So get your witnesses, okay? So that by the mouth, and here he is quoting what we just read from Deuteronomy, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. So John says, witness number 1, even in John chapter 8, verse 17, Jesus said this, even in your law it has been written that the testimony of 2 men is true. That's a fun chapter. We'll get there. So John begins, I'm keep running ahead of myself. Hebrews 10, verse 28, another. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. We see this principle repeated. So that's one way to identify a principle within the text. Okay, so John is adding strength to his argument by appealing to, 1, what the people believe about John the Baptist. John the Baptist is in extremely high favor with the people. John was a strange guy. He lived in a strange manner by the estimation of other people. Of course, he wore the strange clothes, like camel hair clothing, rough clothing. He lived out in the wilderness. He ate bugs and things like that. So did people follow him because he was weird and interesting? No, they didn't. People followed John because he was holy, because he was a righteous man, and he preached with authority and fearlessness, something that the people were not used to and did not see. John was special in that regard, a special prophet to the people, and the people knew John was a prophet. They all recognized him as that. So John adds to the strength of the argument that he's making by using the testimony of John the Baptist. And 2, he's biblically verifying the validity of his own testimony with a similar testimony. What I said, if you don't believe what I said, what do you think about John the Baptist? That's what he's saying to the people that are reading this. John said the same thing that I'm saying. So he's pulling together the strength of 2 witnesses that Jesus is who he says that he is. Next, Jesus dispenses grace. Jesus dispenses grace. Verse 16. For of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace. What does it mean to receive grace upon grace? What do you think? More than we deserve. It's absolutely more than we deserve. Well, what does it imply to receive grace upon grace? Overflowing. Never ending. Yeah, and are we deserving of never ending grace and forgiveness? No, we're not. That's why, when Peter asked Jesus, how many times do I forgive my brother? Up to 7 times? Jesus is like, Peter, I've forgiven you 7 times since breakfast. And you want to stop at 7? You want to stop forgiving at 7? I tell you, 70 times 7. Of course, he didn't mean stop at 490 either. He was explaining, unlimited. If I forgive you an unlimited amount, that's the expectation that I hold for you to forgive your brothers and sisters. An unlimited amount. How does grace produce both positive and negative behavior in us? Oh, it doesn't always produce positive, and it doesn't always produce negative, but it can. It can produce both. Start with the positive. Let's just start with the positive. How does grace produce positive behavior in us? We imitate it, yeah. And I think about what God's done for me that makes my heart overflow with joy. And I think, man, God's done so much for me, I want to give back to him. that should motivate me to do good for God, to do good things for God. Never with the idea that I'm paying God back, because I can't do that. But I'm just saying thank you to God for what he's done for me in trying to do good for others. How can grace produce negative behavior? Yeah, shall we go on sinning that grace may abound? Heaven forbid. Go. Yeah, otherwise known as entitlement. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but has anyone else ever thought, well, I know this isn't right, but God will forgive me? Ugh, that's awful. Paul said, don't do that. Will God forgive you? Yes, he will. But we want to have a whole lot more of the attitude of, hey, we've been created by God, saved by God, for the purpose of doing the good things that God prepared beforehand, and not thinking along the lines of, how close can I get to sin without sinning? I know that this thing that I am in the habit of doing is sinful, but God will forgive me. But you know what creeps into a person's mind when a habitual sin is in that person's life? Nothing will make you second guess whether or not you are saved like sin in your life. Every time I sin, I say, in one way or another, to myself, how on earth can I not stop sinning? Why can't I stop? And I hear God say, my grace is sufficient for you, Wes. You're not going to be able to stop. Not entirely, not in this life. Keep trying. Keep working. But I also hear this. You could work harder at it than what you do. Which is true most of the time. Verse 17. John continues, for the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. This is interesting. It seems like he's pitting the law against grace and truth. But he's not. It's not what he's doing. He's just making two statements. Got the semicolon there. Both of them can stand alone. The law was given through Moses. That's just a fact. We'll talk about it more. Grace and truth were realized. It's a different thing. Through Jesus Christ. He's not saying that grace and truth were not part of the law. Grace and truth were part of the law. Why was the law given? Not a trick question. Why was the law given? There's a very biblical. Let me give you the very biblical answer. There's different things we can say, but let me give you the most biblical answer. Paul said to the Galatians, chapter 3, verse 24, therefore the law has been our tutor to lead us to Christ. There's a very good explanation of why the law was given. The law, God's law, is perfect. Okay? Now, you take the Ten Commandments. Here's the way I like to think of the law. This is the law for dummies, and this is why I like to think of it like this. You're not the dummy. I'm the dummy. This is the way I like to think of it. The law, the summary of the law is the Ten Commandments. Okay? All the other laws that come after the Ten Commandments are just offshoots of those 10. All right? The Ten Commandments, if they are lived perfectly, they represent perfection. They represent holiness. Well, we learned really quick in our lives the same thing that the Israelites learned really quick in their lives after the law was given. We can't pull that off. We can't be perfect. So how is understanding that we can't be perfect, how does that lead us to Christ? How does that work? Because Christ solved our problem. God said, obey these laws. We can't do it. We can, to a certain extent, we can obey some of them pretty well. We can't obey all of them. We certainly can't obey them perfectly. Remember, Paul said, if you're guilty of breaking one law, you're guilty of breaking the entire law. So that gets all of us. But then Christ came. And when Christ came, Christ did what we couldn't do. He became what we could not become. And that's how grace and truth were realized through Jesus. The law pointed us to him. Next, Jesus defines God. Jesus defines God. Verse 18, no one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. Now that's an unusual sounding sentence, so let's work on it just a little bit. First, we have that expression, we have that once again there. Now, does anyone have a version that reads differently in verse 18? Where mine says, the only begotten God. Say again. One and only, okay. The unique one. Those are both all right. The very best translation is this one. It says, John said, no one has seen God at any time, the only begotten God. Who is that? Who's the only begotten God? It's no trick. It's Jesus. This is John equating Jesus and God as the same. I know the language sounds a little bit confusing, but that's exactly what he says here. He doesn't refer to Jesus here as the Son of God. He refers to him as the only begotten God, putting him on equal footing with God. But then he says this about Jesus. This is confusing. He is in the bosom of the Father. Like, what on earth does that mean? And then he says, Jesus has explained him. Jesus has explained God. Okay, so only begotten God, like I said, that's the best translation. That word bosom there is the Greek word kolpos. And check out the meanings, the different meanings of this word. That is the word that is used if you're referring to a creek. Isn't that interesting? And you'll see why. It's also the same word that's used to refer to a bay. It's the same word that is used for the word fold, like to fold something in half. And it also is the same word used for pocket. Now, what is a creek? A creek is a fold in the land, a division in the land by water, by flowing water. Okay? A bay is a pocket of water. You know, a pocket, we can just refer to a pocket. There's a pocket on my shirt, but there's, so what does he mean? Like when we combine all those and we kind of get the idea of what do those mean. The translation says in the bosom of the Father, which isn't bad, but it's not great either. Because what if it said it was not going to say the creek of the Father or the bay of the Father. Probably the best translation would be who is in the fold. What does it mean to be in the fold with someone else? Yeah, at the Father's side. I mean, if we're in the fold, of course we think of a sheepfold, we're in it together. John is saying that Jesus, who is folded into God, like they are folded into one another. That's how close he is to God. Jesus has shown us God, and he has explained to us who God is. It takes a little bit to get there, but I think it's important to do some of that heavy lifting with the text in these tricky parts of it to try to really get a grip on what John's talking about. John chapter 14, 8 through 11. Let me demonstrate this, how Jesus did. This will make a lot more sense to you. Philip said to Jesus, "Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us." Jesus said to him, "Have I been so long with you, and yet you have not come to know me, Philip?" Philip says, "Show us the Father." Jesus says, "I've been with you all this time, and you don't know me?" Speaking on behalf of the Father, as if he is the Father. "He who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Do you not believe that I am in the Father?" That makes more sense. In the fold of the Father. I am at the heart of the Father. And the Father is in me. We are a part of one another. The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own initiative, but the Father abiding in me does his works. Like, these aren't even my words. These are the Father's words, which they are his words. But it's hard to understand Jesus speaking in his humility. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. And if you don't believe the words I'm saying, look what he says, the same thing he says to other people. Otherwise, believe because of the works themselves. If my words aren't enough for you to believe that I'm God, look at what I do. I do the things that only God is capable of doing. If you want to know God, if you want to see God, look at Jesus. Look to Jesus. That's where we conclude tonight. We will offer an invitation and have a closing song. If anyone has a reason to respond to the invitation, feel free to do that as we sing. If it's convenient for you, let's stand as we sing. And in case you didn't get the number, I believe it's number 387. Yes, 387 together.